"Get that criminal out of my house!" his mother-in-law screamed, but when the cops arrived, they saluted the biker. The patrol car's lights painted the suburban street in red and blue, while Knox stood in the driveway with his hands visible, his leather vest catching the colors like a war flag. Inside the house, Patricia Whitmore was still screaming about the criminal in her daughter's living room, still demanding justice, still certain she'd saved her family from a monster. Knox didn't move, didn't argue, just waited with the patience of a man who'd stood in worse places with higher stakes, watching the two officers approach with their hands near their weapons. Then the younger cop's flashlight hit the patches on Knox's vest, the combat medic rocker, the Purple Heart pin, the unit insignia from the 75th Ranger Regiment, and everything stopped. The officer's hand snapped to his forehead so fast it was almost violent. The older cop followed, both of them standing at attention in a suburban driveway at midnight, while a mother-in-law watched through the window, her certainty beginning to crack. Wait, before the next ride begins. If this story already hit you right in the chest, tell us where you're watching from. To ride with the Brotherhood through the next promise, loss, or redemption, subscribe and join the club. Engines up, back to the road. 3 hours earlier, Knox had pulled his Harley into the driveway of the house his wife Sarah had grown up in, the engine's rumble dying to silence in a neighborhood where every lawn was exactly the same shade of green and every door was painted an acceptable shade of neutral. He'd been riding for 6 hours straight, coming up from Tucson after getting Sarah's call, the one that said her father had collapsed, that they needed to come now, that time was running short. Sarah had driven up 2 days earlier in the sedan, taking the safer route, the reasonable route. Knox had stayed behind to close the custom shop for a week, to make arrangements, to handle the things that couldn't wait. Then he'd ridden through the night because that was who he was, a man who showed up when his people needed him, even when showing up meant walking into the house of a woman who'd spent 5 years telling her daughter she'd married a criminal. Patricia Whitmore had opened the door before Knox reached the porch, and her face had cycled through surprise, disgust, and righteous fury in the space of a heartbeat. "You're not coming in here dressed like that," she'd said, her voice sharp enough to cut glass. Knox had looked down at himself. Leather vest over a clean black shirt, jeans that weren't ripped, boots that were scuffed but functional. The vest carried patches from his military service, from the motorcycle club he joined after coming home from Afghanistan, from a life lived on his own terms. "Patricia," he'd said evenly, "I'm here for Sarah and for Frank." "Frank doesn't want to see you," Patricia had replied, though her eyes had flickered, uncertain. That's not what Sarah said when she called. Sarah doesn't know what she wants. She's confused. She's been confused since the day she met you. Knox had taken a breath, held it, let it out slowly. This was an old argument, an old wound. Patricia Whitmore had decided who Knox was the first time she'd seen him, had looked at the leather and the patches and the bike and decided he was everything wrong with the world. No amount of evidence to the contrary had ever changed her mind. "I'm going to see my wife," Knox had said quietly, "and I'm going to see Frank. You can let me in, or you can make this harder than it needs to be, but I'm not leaving." Patricia's face had hardened. "If you set 1 foot in this house, I'm calling the police. I'll tell them you threatened me. Tell them you're a gang member, a criminal, that I'm afraid for my safety." "That's your right," Knox had said, and had walked past her into the house. He'd found Sarah in the kitchen, her eyes red from crying, her mother's best china spread across the counter like she'd been trying to keep her hands busy. When she'd seen Knox, her face had crumpled with relief. "You came," she'd said, moving into his arms. "Always," Knox had replied, holding her while her mother watched from the doorway with barely contained rage. "He's upstairs," Sarah had whispered. "The hospice nurse is with him. He's been asking for you." Knox had looked at Patricia then, saw the woman's jaw clench. "He doesn't know what he's saying," Patricia had snapped. "He's on morphine. He's delirious." "He knows exactly what he's saying," Sarah had shot back, and there was steel in her voice that Knox rarely heard. "He asked for Knox specifically, said he needed to talk to him." Her voice had broken. Knox had kissed the top of Sarah's head, then had moved toward the stairs. Patricia had stepped in his way. "I won't have gang colors in my house. Take off that vest or get out." Knox had looked at the vest, at the patches he'd earned with blood and sweat and years of service. The combat medic rocker from his time saving lives in Kandahar. The Purple Heart from the IED that had nearly killed him and had killed 2 of his brothers. "No," he said simply. "Then I'm calling the police, right now. I'll tell them you broke into my house, that you threatened me, that I want you arrested." "Mom, stop," Sarah had said, moving between them. "Stop this. Dad is dying. Knox drove 6 hours to be here. Whatever issues you have with him, whatever you think he is, can wait until after." "He's a criminal," Patricia had hissed. "Look at him. Look at what he's wearing. Those patches, that club, it's all a front for drugs and violence and everything decent people stand against." Knox had felt the old anger rise, but it pushed it down. This wasn't the time. Frank was upstairs, dying, and Knox had promised to be there. He'd made that promise 2 weeks ago when Frank had called him, when the old man had said he needed to talk to Knox about something important, something he should have said years ago. "I'm going upstairs," Knox had said. "You can call whoever you want." He'd walked past Patricia, up the stairs, feeling her hatred like heat on his back. Behind him, he'd heard Sarah trying to calm her mother, trying to explain, trying to bridge a gap that had been growing for 5 years. Frank Whitmore had been in the master bedroom, propped up on pillows, oxygen tubes in his nose, his body a shadow of what it had been. The hospice nurse, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes, had looked up when Knox entered, and her gaze had gone to his vest, then to his face. "You're Knox," she'd said. "Yes, ma'am." "He's been waiting for you." She'd stood, checked Frank's vitals one more time, then had touched Knox's arm as she passed. "Whatever he needs to say, let him say it, even if it's hard to hear, especially if it's hard to hear." Then she left, closing the door softly behind her. Frank had opened his eyes, and they'd been clear despite the morphine, despite the cancer eating through his lungs and liver and everywhere else. "Knox," he'd rasped. "I'm here, Frank." Knox had pulled a chair close to the bed, had sat down carefully. "Sarah said you wanted to talk." "Been wanting to talk for 5 years," Frank had said, each word an effort. "Been a coward about it. But I'm running out of time to be brave." Knox had waited. "I owe you an apology," Frank had said, "for not standing up to Patricia, for letting her treat you the way she has, for not telling her the truth." "The truth about what?" Frank had closed his eyes, gathered strength. "The truth about who you are, what you did, what you gave up." Knox had felt something cold settle in his chest. "Frank, you don't have to." "Yes, I do," Frank had interrupted. "I should have done it years ago. Should have told her the first time she called you a criminal. Should have shown her. But I was afraid. Afraid of her anger, afraid of the questions, afraid of everything I'd buried." "What are you talking about?" Frank had opened his eyes again, and they'd been wet. "I know what you did in Afghanistan. I know about the village, about the ambush, about the 17 hours you held that aid station while everyone around you died." Knox had gone still. That wasn't something he talked about, ever. The military had classified most of it, and what wasn't classified was protected by the kind of silence that came with survivor's guilt and trauma that didn't fade. "How do you—" "Because I know Colonel James Brenner," Frank had said. "He was my best friend in college. We served together in Desert Storm. Stayed in touch all these years. When Sarah brought you home that first time, told me your name, where you'd served, I made a call. Asked Jim what he could tell me about Knox Garrett, combat medic, 75th Rangers." Frank had started coughing then. a wet, rattling sound that had taken minutes to subside. When he could speak again, his voice was weaker. Jim told me you were the bravest man he'd ever commanded. Told me about the ambush, about how you kept 19 wounded soldiers alive for 17 hours while the Taliban tried to overrun your position. Told me you ran out of morphine after the first 4 hours, ran out of bandages after 8, but kept working, kept fighting, saved every single one of those men. Knox had looked away, feeling the memories rise like smoke. The heat, the blood, the screaming that never stopped. The faces of men he'd held together with pressure and prayer and sheer stubborn refusal to let them die. He told me you took 3 bullets doing it, Frank had continued, that you kept working with a bullet in your shoulder and another in your leg. That when the relief force finally reached you, you were still on your feet, still treating wounded, even though you'd lost enough blood that you should have been dead. I was doing my job, Knox had said quietly. You were doing more than your job, Frank had said. You were being a hero. And when Patricia started calling you a criminal, started telling everyone who'd listened that her daughter had married gang trash, I should have told her, should have showed her the truth. But I didn't. I let her believe it because it was easier than fighting. And I'm sorry. I'm so damn sorry. Knox had felt his throat tighten. Frank, it's okay. It's not okay, Frank had rasped. Nothing about it is okay. You've been nothing but good to Sarah, nothing but respectful to me. You work hard, you don't drink, you don't run around, you show up when you're needed. But Patricia can't see past the leather and the patches, and I let her stay blind because I was too much of a coward to make her see. Downstairs, a door had slammed. Raised voices had echoed up the stairs, Patricia's shrill and demanding, Sarah's exhausted and pleading. She's calling the police, Frank had said. Isn't she? Probably, Knox had agreed. Good, Frank had said, and had smiled despite the pain. Let her. Let them come. Let them see what I should have made her see years ago. Frank, no. This is how it ends. This is how I make it right. You stay here with me. When they come, when they see, when they understand, that's when Patricia will finally have to face the truth. Knox had wanted to argue, wanted to leave before it got worse, but Frank's hand had found his, and the old man's grip had been surprisingly strong. Stay, Frank whispered. Please, let me do this one thing right before I go. So, Knox had stayed. He'd sat with Frank while the old man drifted in and out of consciousness, while the morphine pulled him under and then released him, while time became fluid and meaningless. They'd talked when Frank was lucid, about Sarah, about the shop Knox ran, about the motorcycle club and what it really meant, about the brotherhood that came from serving together and surviving together. And Frank had told stories about his own service, about friends he'd lost, about coming home to a country that didn't understand what he'd seen, what he'd done, what he carried. He'd talked about how he'd buried it all under normalcy, under suburban comfort, under a marriage to a woman who wanted everything to be safe and clean and understandable. I love Patricia, Frank had said at one point, but she never understood that some things can't be made safe. Some experiences mark you, change you, make you into someone who doesn't fit in the box anymore. You understand that. Sarah understands that. That's why you two work. You both know what it's like to carry weight that never gets lighter. Knox had nodded, thinking about Sarah, about the way she'd never pressured him to talk about Afghanistan, never demanded explanations for the nightmares, never made him feel broken for being different from the men in her mother's neighborhood. Downstairs, the argument had continued. Then there had been silence. Then the sound of a phone call being made. Frank had smiled. Here we go. "This is going to make things worse," Knox had said. "No," Frank had replied. "This is going to make things clear." Finally. 20 minutes later, the police had arrived. Knox had gone downstairs when he'd heard the knock, had found Patricia standing by the door with her arms crossed and her face triumphant. Sarah had been in the living room, her face pale with exhaustion and dread. "The police are here," Patricia had announced, "and you're going to be arrested for trespassing, for threatening me, for breaking into my house." "I didn't break in," Knox had said calmly. "You opened the door. I walked through it. And I haven't threatened anyone." "You're a gang member," Patricia had hissed. "Those patches, that vest, it's all evidence. Evidence of criminal activity." Knox had looked at Sarah, saw the pain in her eyes, the shame of watching her mother do this. "I'm sorry," Sarah had whispered. "Don't be," Knox had said. "This isn't your fault." Patricia had opened the door, and 2 police officers had stood on the porch. One older, maybe 50, with gray at his temples and the weathered look of a career cop, and one younger, perhaps 30, with the eager attention of someone still learning the job. "Officers," Patricia had said, her voice pitched to maximum distress. "Thank God you're here. This man," she'd pointed at Knox, "forced his way into my house. He's a gang member, a criminal. I want him arrested immediately." The older officer had looked past Patricia to Knox, his eyes taking in the vest, the patches, the way Knox stood. Calm, hands visible, non-threatening. "Sir," the officer had said, "I'm Officer Martinez. This is Officer Chen. We got a call about a disturbance. Can you tell us what's going on?" "My father-in-law is dying upstairs," Knox had said evenly. "I came to see him. My wife is here," he gestured to Sarah, "and her mother doesn't approve of me. That's what's going on." "He's lying," Patricia had interjected. "He forced his way in. He threatened me. Look at him. Look at what he's wearing. Those are gang colors. He's a criminal." Officer Chen's flashlight had swept over Knox's vest, and the young officer had leaned in, studying the patches. Then his posture had changed, had gone rigid. "Sergeant," Chen had said quietly. "What?" "Look at the patches." Martinez had stepped closer, his own flashlight joining Chen's, and Knox had stood still while they examined his vest. The combat medic rocker, the unit patch, the Purple Heart, the small pin that identified him as a combat veteran of Operation Enduring Freedom. Officer Chen's hand had snapped to his forehead first, the salute so sudden and sharp that it made Patricia gasp. Martinez had followed a heartbeat later, both officers standing at attention in the doorway. "Sir," Chen had said, voice tight with emotion, "thank you for your service." Patricia had made a strangled sound. "What are you doing? Why are you saluting him? He's a criminal!" Martinez had lowered his hand slowly, his eyes never leaving Knox. "Ma'am, this man isn't a criminal. He's a decorated combat veteran, Purple Heart recipient, Ranger Regiment. Do you have any idea what that means?" "It means nothing," Patricia had snapped. "Those patches, that motorcycle club, it's all a cover for—" "Ma'am," Martinez had interrupted, his voice carrying the weight of authority now. "I'm a Marine Corps veteran, Iraq 2007. Officer Chen here is Army, Afghanistan 2011. We both know what these patches mean. We know what it costs to earn them. And I can tell you right now, we're not arresting this man for trespassing when his father-in-law is dying upstairs and his wife is standing right there. But he forced his way in." "Did he break down a door?" Martinez had asked. "No, but did he threaten you physically?" "He walked past me after I told him not to enter." "That's not breaking and entering, ma'am. That's a family dispute. And unless there's evidence of actual criminal activity, we're not getting involved in family drama." Chen had looked at Knox. "Sir, is your father-in-law upstairs? Can we speak with him?" "He's in hospice care," Knox had said. "Lung cancer. He's heavily medicated. But yes, he's upstairs. He asked me to come. Called me himself 2 weeks ago. I want to speak with him, Martinez had said, and it hadn't been a request. They'd all gone upstairs then, Knox leading, the 2 officers following, Patricia trailing behind, still sputtering protests, Sarah bringing up the rear with tears streaming down her face. The hospice nurse had been in the hallway, and she'd nodded at Knox. He's awake, she'd said. Heard the commotion. Wants to know what's happening. Frank had been sitting up more when they'd entered, his eyes clear despite the pain, despite the morphine fog. "Officers," he'd rasped. "What's this about?" "Mr. Whitmore," Martinez had said respectfully, "your wife called us. Said this man," he'd gestured to Knox, "forced his way into your house against her will. Can you tell us if that's accurate?" Frank had looked at Patricia, and something hard had crossed his face. "My wife is wrong about a lot of things. This is one of them. I called Knox, asked him to come. He's my son-in-law. He's family. He has every right to be here." "Frank, you don't know what you're saying," Patricia had started. "The medication—" "I know exactly what I'm saying," Frank had interrupted, his voice stronger than it had been in hours. "I'm dying, Patricia. I don't have time for your prejudice anymore. Knox is one of the best men I've ever known. He served his country with honor, saved lives, earned the respect of everyone who served with him. And you've spent 5 years treating him like garbage because he rides a motorcycle and wears leather. Frank—" "Officers," Frank had continued, ignoring his wife. "In the closet over there, top shelf, there's a box. Would one of you mind getting it down for me?" Chen had moved to the closet, had pulled down a wooden box and brought it to the bed. Frank had opened it with shaking hands, and Knox had seen what was inside. Photographs, letters, military documents, and a folded flag in a triangle case. Frank had pulled out a folder, had handed it to Martinez. "Read it out loud so Patricia can hear." Martinez had opened the folder, and Knox had seen his eyes widen as he read the first page. Then the officer had started reading aloud. "This is a classified after-action report from Operation Enduring Freedom, September 15, 2012. Subject, combat action at Forward Operating Base, Python. Staff Sergeant Knox Garrett, combat medic, 75th Ranger Regiment, distinguished himself through extraordinary heroism during an extended enemy engagement. When his unit was ambushed and pinned down with multiple casualties, SSG Garrett established an aid station under sustained enemy fire and maintained it for 17 hours while awaiting relief forces." Martinez had continued reading, his voice steady but increasingly emotional. The report had detailed everything: the casualties, the ammunition expended, the times Knox had run into direct fire to retrieve wounded soldiers, the 3 bullets he'd taken, the supplies he'd exhausted, the improvisations he'd made to keep 19 men alive when, by all rights, most of them should have died. When Martinez had finished, the bedroom had been silent except for Frank's labored breathing. "That's who Knox Garrett is," Frank had said, looking at his wife. "That's who you've been calling a criminal for 5 years. A man who saved 19 lives in 17 hours. A man who took 3 bullets and kept working. A man who earned a Silver Star, a Purple Heart, and the respect of every soldier who knows what he did." Patricia had been white as paper. "Why didn't you tell me?" "Because you never asked," Frank had said, and there was a lifetime of disappointment in his voice. "You saw the leather and made up your mind, decided he was trash, and nothing I said was going to change that. So I stayed quiet. But I'm not staying quiet anymore. I'm dying, and I'm going to die knowing I told the truth. Knox Garrett is a hero. He's earned his place in this family, and you owe him an apology." Patricia had opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again. No words had come out. Officer Martinez had folded the report carefully, had handed it back to Frank. Then he turned to Knox and saluted again, holding it longer this time. "Sir," Martinez had said, "it's an honor to meet you. Thank you for your service. Thank you for saving those men." Officer Chen had saluted as well. "Thank you, sir." Knox had returned the salutes, had felt the weight of all of it. The memories, the years, the pain, the pride, the cost of carrying it all alone. "You're welcome," Knox had said quietly. Martinez had turned to Patricia then. "Ma'am, we're going to leave now. There's no criminal activity here, no trespassing, just a family dealing with a difficult situation. I strongly suggest you drop this matter and focus on your husband." "But, ma'am," Martinez had said, and his voice had carried an edge now, "your husband is dying, and you just tried to have a decorated war hero arrested for coming to say goodbye. I don't know what your problem is with veterans or bikers or anyone who doesn't fit your idea of acceptable, but I can tell you this, you're wrong, dead wrong. This man has more honor in his little finger than most people have in their whole lives. So whatever apology you're thinking about making, you better make it soon, before it's too late." Then the officers had left, their footsteps heavy on the stairs, and the house had fallen into a silence so thick it was hard to breathe. Patricia had stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a long time, not speaking, not moving, just staring at Knox like she was seeing him for the first time. Sarah had gone to her father's bedside, had taken his hand, had whispered something Knox couldn't hear. Finally, Patricia had spoken. "I didn't know." "You could have," Frank had said, exhausted now, the burst of energy fading. "Any time in the last 5 years, you could have asked, could have listened, but you decided who he was without evidence, made up your mind based on clothing and a motorcycle. I thought I was protecting Sarah." "From what?" Frank had asked. "From a man who loves her, who treats her well, who shows up when she needs him? You weren't protecting her, you were protecting your own prejudice." Patricia had flinched like she'd been slapped. "I need to rest," Frank had said, his voice fading. "You all need to talk, but not here. Let me sleep." Sarah had kissed her father's forehead, and Knox had squeezed the old man's hand. "Thank you," Knox said quietly. "Thank you for coming," Frank had replied, "and for staying. That's what matters, showing up, staying, even when it's hard." They'd left Frank with the hospice nurse and had gone downstairs to the living room. Patricia had sat in her chair, rigid and pale. Sarah had sat on the couch next to Knox, her hand finding his. For a long time, no one had spoken. Then Patricia had said, her voice small, "I'm sorry." The words had been so quiet, Knox had almost missed them. "I'm sorry," Patricia had repeated, louder now. "I was wrong. About you. About what I thought you were. About everything." Knox had waited. "When Sarah brought you home that first time," Patricia had continued, "all I saw was the motorcycle and the leather. All I could think about was danger, risk, the potential for Sarah to get hurt. I didn't see you. I saw what I was afraid of." "Mom," Sarah had started, but Patricia held up a hand. "No, let me finish. I need to say this." Patricia had looked at Knox directly for what might have been the first time ever. "Frank tried to tell me, tried to explain that you were a good man, that you'd served, that you were nothing like what I thought. But I wouldn't listen. I was so certain I was right that I couldn't hear anything that contradicted what I believed." She'd paused, gathering courage. "I treated you terribly, called you names, told people in my church that my daughter had married a criminal, prayed for Sarah to leave you, refused to have you in my house for holidays, made everything harder than it needed to be, and all of it was based on fear and ignorance and my own narrow-mindedness." Knox had felt Sarah's grip tighten on his hand. "The officers were right," Patricia had said. "Frank was right. I owe you an apology, a real one. Not just for tonight, but for 5 years of treating you like you were worthless when you're anything but." "I appreciate that," Knox had said carefully. "I don't expect you to forgive me," Patricia had continued. "I wouldn't forgive me. But I want you to know, I'm going to try to do better, to see you for who you really are instead of what I projected onto you." Sarah had started crying then, quiet tears that spoke of years of tension, years of being caught between the man she loved and the mother who couldn't accept him. "Mom," Sarah had said, "thank you. You don't know how much I've needed to hear that." Patricia had gotten up then, had crossed the room slowly, like she was walking through deep water. She'd stood in front of Knox and had seen how hard this was for her, how much it cost to admit she'd been wrong. "Can you forgive me?" she'd asked. Knox had thought about it, about 5 years of cold shoulders and cutting remarks, about holidays spent apart because he wasn't welcome, about the way Patricia had looked at him like he was something dirty that had contaminated her pristine world. But he'd also thought about Frank upstairs, dying, using his last strength to tell the truth, about Sarah's tears, about the fact that holding on to anger would only poison what time they had left. "Yeah," Knox had said, "I can forgive you." Patricia had reached out then, hesitant, and Knox had stood. She'd embraced him awkwardly and had felt her shoulders shake. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for being patient with me. Thank you for loving my daughter. Thank you for your service." When she'd pulled back, her face had been wet with tears. "Tell me about it," she said. "About Afghanistan, about what happened, about the men you saved. I want to understand. I want to know who you really are." So Knox had told her, not everything. Some things couldn't be told, shouldn't be told, but enough. About the ambush, about the 17 hours. About the faces of the men he'd kept alive. About the weight of carrying that memory, carrying the knowledge that he'd been the difference between life and death for 19 people. He'd told her about coming home with 3 bullet wounds and trauma that never fully healed. About the nightmares that still woke him up some nights, sweating and reaching for medical supplies that weren't there. About the way the motorcycle club had given him a new kind of brotherhood, a new family of veterans who understood what it was like to carry weight that civilians couldn't see. Patricia had listened without interrupting, and when Knox had finished, she'd said, "I'm so sorry you went through that, and I'm sorry I made it harder by refusing to see it." "It's okay," Knox had said, and meant it. They'd spent the rest of the night taking shifts at Frank's bedside. The hospice nurse had said it could be hours or days, there was no way to know. So they'd waited together, Knox and Sarah and Patricia, finding a fragile peace in the shared vigil. At some point near dawn, Patricia had brought coffee to the bedroom where Knox sat with Frank. The old man was sleeping, his breathing shallow and rattling. "Knox," Patricia had said quietly, "can I ask you something?" "Sure." "The patches on your vest, the motorcycle club, what does it mean? I know Frank tried to explain, but I wouldn't listen. I'm listening now." Knox had looked down at his vest, at the patches he wore. "It means brotherhood. It means I ride with people who understand what it's like to serve and come home different. It means I have a family of veterans who've got my back, who understand the nightmares, who don't judge me for the parts of me that got broken in the war." "Is it dangerous, the club?" "Can be," Knox had admitted, "just like anything can be. But it's not what you think. We're not criminals. We're just men who ride together, who look out for each other, who've earned the right to wear these patches because we served our country first." Patricia had nodded slowly. "I see that now. I wish I'd seen it sooner." "Better late than never," Knox had said. Frank had stirred then, his eyes opening. "Patricia." "I'm here," she'd said, moving to his side. "Did you apologize to Knox?" "I did." "Good." Frank's breathing had been labored. "That's good. Can die knowing I set things right." "Don't talk like that," Patricia had said, her voice breaking. "Have to talk like that. It's true, but it's okay. I'm ready. Gotta see my girls one more time. Gotta tell the truth. Gotta make things right. That's enough." Sarah had come in then, sensing something, and they'd all gathered around the bed. 3 people who'd spent years in conflict, finally united in grief. Frank had looked at Knox. "Take care of her. Take care of both of them." "I will," Knox had promised. "And keep riding. Keep the brotherhood. Don't let anyone make you small because they can't understand what you are." "I won't." Frank had smiled then, peaceful, and had closed his eyes. Good. That's good. He'd slipped away an hour later, as the sun was rising, with his family around him and his secrets finally told. The funeral had been 3 days later, and the turnout had been larger than anyone expected. Frank's military buddies had come, old men in their 70s and 80s, walking with canes but standing straight when they saluted the casket. The motorcycle club had come too, 20 brothers in leather, standing respectfully at the back of the church, a wall of quiet support. Patricia had asked Knox to give one of the eulogies, and he had, talking about Frank's service, his friendship, his last act of courage in telling the truth when it mattered most. After the service, at the reception, Patricia had done something that shocked everyone who knew her. She'd approached the bikers, had thanked them for coming, had asked about their service and their stories. She'd listened with genuine interest, and Knox had watched her begin to understand what she'd been missing all along. One of the bikers, a man named Dalton with gray in his beard and scars on his hands, had pulled Knox aside. "Your mother-in-law is trying." "Yeah," Knox had agreed. "That's not easy. Changing your mind after years of being certain takes courage." "Frank gave her the courage," Knox had said, "gave her permission to see differently." "Good man, your father-in-law, the kind who understands that truth matters, even at the end, especially at the end." After most of the guests had left, Patricia had approached Knox again. "Can I ask you something?" "Of course." "Would you teach me to ride?" Knox had stared at her. "What? A motorcycle? Would you teach me? I think Frank would have liked that. Liked knowing I was trying to understand your world instead of judging it." Knox had looked at Sarah, who'd been smiling through tears. "I'd be honored," Knox had said. 6 months later, Knox had pulled into Patricia's driveway on his Harley with Sarah on the back. Patricia had been waiting on the porch, wearing a leather jacket Knox had helped her pick out, her face nervous but determined. "Ready?" Knox had asked. "I think so," Patricia had said. She'd ridden behind Knox that first time, tentative and scared, but unwilling to back down. They'd taken the quiet roads outside town, nothing too fast or too technical, just enough to get a feel for it. When they'd gotten back, Patricia had been grinning like a teenager. "I see it now," she'd said. "See what Frank saw. The freedom, the simplicity, the way everything else falls away when you're on the road." Over the months that followed, Patricia had continued learning. She'd gotten her motorcycle license, had bought a used bike with Knox's help, had started riding with him and Sarah on weekend trips. She'd come to club events, had met the brothers, had learned their stories and their sacrifices. She'd apologized to each of them individually for the assumptions she'd made, for the judgment she'd passed without evidence. And to a man, they'd accepted her apologies with grace, understanding that change was hard and that admitting wrong took strength. One night, sitting around a fire at a club gathering, Patricia had told Knox something that meant everything. "Frank was right about you, right about all of this. I wasted 5 years being afraid of something beautiful because I couldn't see past my own prejudice. I'm grateful I got the chance to change. Grateful Frank gave me that gift before he left." "He loved you," Knox had said, "even when it was hard." "I know, and I'm trying to love the way he did, without conditions, without judgment, just showing up and staying, even when it's uncomfortable." Sarah had leaned against Knox's shoulder and had felt the peace of it, the wholeness of finally having his wife's family accept him, not despite who he was, but because of it. A year after Frank's death, the club had a memorial ride for fallen members and veterans who'd passed. Patricia had ridden her own bike in the pack, her form improving with every mile, her confidence growing. When they'd stopped at the memorial site, a place where names were carved into stone, names of brothers lost to war and to the hard years after, Patricia had walked among the stones, reading names, understanding now what each one represented. She'd found Frank's name there. Knox had arranged for it months earlier, making sure Frank Whitmore was remembered among the brothers, among the men who'd served and sacrificed and understood what it meant to carry weight that never got lighter. Patricia had knelt by the stone, had touched her husband's name, and had wept quietly. Knox had stood back, giving her space, but she'd reached out a hand and had taken it, kneeling beside her. "Thank you," Shed said, "for honoring him like this, for making sure he's remembered here with people who understand." "He earned it," Knox said, "and so did you. You changed, you grew, you became someone who could see beyond fear. That's its own kind of courage." At the ceremony, several veterans had spoken about the fallen, about the cost of service, about the importance of brotherhood. When it came time for family to speak, Patricia had stood. Her voice had been steady as she talked about Frank, about his service, about the way he'd lived with honor even when it was hard. But she had also talked about her own journey, about the prejudice she'd carried, about the night she'd called the police on a decorated veteran because she couldn't see past a leather vest. "I was wrong," Shed said to the assembled crowd of bikers and veterans and families. "Wrong about what courage looked like. Wrong about what service meant. Wrong about who deserved respect and who deserved judgment. My husband spent his last hours teaching me to see differently. Teaching me that the men and women who wear these patches, who ride these bikes, who carry these memories, they're not criminals or gang members or anything to be feared. They're heroes, they're family, they're exactly the kind of people we should honor." The crowd had responded with the rumble of approval, knuckles on leather, voices raised in agreement. After the ceremony, as they'd prepared to ride back, Officer Martinez and Officer Chen had shown up, both in civilian clothes, both on their own motorcycles. They'd ridden with the pack, 2 more veterans among the many, 2 more brothers who understood. When they'd stopped for food later, Martinez had sat down next to Knox. "Never forgot that night," Martinez had said. "Never forgot standing in that doorway, seeing those patches, understanding what they meant. Changed how I approach every call. Makes me ask questions before making assumptions." "That's all anyone can do," Knox had said. "Ask questions. Stay curious. Don't let fear or prejudice make decisions for you." "Your mother-in-law figured that out," Martinez had observed. "Not many people can change like that." "She had a good teacher," Knox had said, thinking of Frank, of the old man's courage in using his last strength to tell the truth. 2 years after Frank's death, Sarah had given birth to a daughter. They'd named her Frances, after Frank, and Patricia had been in the delivery room, holding Sarah's hand through the labor, crying with joy when the baby finally arrived. Knox had held his daughter for the first time in the hospital room, her tiny body wrapped in a blanket, her eyes closed, her breathing soft and steady. Patricia had been there too, looking at her granddaughter with wonder. "She's beautiful," Patricia had said. "She is," Knox had agreed. "What kind of life do you think she'll have?" Patricia had asked. "With a father who rides, who wears the patch, who carries all that history." Knox had thought about it. "I think she'll have an honest life, a life where she learns that courage comes in many forms, where she understands that service and sacrifice matter, where she knows that family isn't just blood, it's the people who show up, who stay, who hold your secrets and your sorrows and never walk away." Patricia had smiled. Frank would have loved that answer. "Yeah," Knox had said, "he would have." As the sun had set that first day of Frances's life, Knox had stood by the hospital window, holding his daughter, watching the parking lot where his motorcycle waited beside Patricia's, where the leather and chrome caught the last light of day. He'd thought about Frank, about the night the police had come, about the moment everything had changed. He'd thought about how close he'd come to leaving, to walking away from the conflict, to sparing himself the pain of Patricia's judgment. How different everything would have been if Frank hadn't had the courage to tell the truth. Truth was a funny thing. It could cut like a knife or heal like medicine, depending on how it was used. Frank had used it as medicine, had dosed his wife with it even when it was painful, even when it cost him, because he'd understood that lies, even lies of omission, were a kind of poison that corrupted everything they touched. Sarah had joined Knox at the window, had leaned against him while they both looked at their daughter. "Your dad would have been proud," Knox had said. "He would have," Sarah had agreed, "of you, of Mom, of all of us for figuring it out. We almost didn't. But we did. That's what matters. We chose truth over comfort. We chose growth over being right. We chose each other." Knox had kissed his wife's forehead, had looked down at his daughter, and had made a silent promise. He'd raise her to ask questions, to challenge assumptions, to see people as they really were instead of what fear told her to see. He'd raise her to understand that courage wasn't just facing danger. It was facing your own prejudices, your own mistakes, your own capacity for being wrong. He'd raise her to know that family came in many forms. Some wore uniforms, some wore leather, some wore doubt and fear and learned to shed them like old skin. And he'd raise her to understand that sometimes the most heroic thing you could do wasn't saving lives under fire or taking bullets for strangers. Sometimes it was simply changing your mind, admitting you were wrong, and choosing to see differently. That was what Patricia had done. That was what Frank had made possible. And that was worth more than any medal, any patch, any recognition from any authority. It was the quiet heroism of transformation, of becoming better than you were, of choosing love over fear. Outside, the parking lot was emptying, nurses changing shifts, visitors leaving. But Knox's bike and Patricia's bike remained side by side, chrome and leather in the fading light, symbols of a journey that had started with judgment and ended with understanding. Francis stirred in his arms, made a small sound, settled again. "Welcome to the family, little one," Knox whispered. "All of it. The complicated, messy, beautiful family that fights and forgives and shows up when it matters." Sarah was crying quietly, happy tears. Patricia came to stand with them. 3 generations looking out at a world that was gentler than it had been, kinder than it had been, because people had chosen truth over prejudice, growth over certainty, love over fear. "Thank you," Patricia said to Knox, "for being patient with me, for giving me time to change, for not walking away when you had every right to." "That's what family does," Knox said. "We stay, even when it's hard, especially when it's hard." Patricia put her hand on Knox's shoulder, and for a moment they all stood together in comfortable silence, watching the world turn while a new life breathed softly in the center of everything they'd built. Outside, somewhere in the distance, Knox heard the rumble of motorcycles passing. Brothers on the road, riding to somewhere or from something, carrying their own stories and their own weight. The sound was familiar and comforting, a reminder that he wasn't alone, had never been alone, that the brotherhood extended far beyond blood and reached into every corner where people chose to show up and stay. Frank had understood that, had lived it, had died making sure others understood it too. And now Francis would grow up understanding it as well, would learn that heroes came in many forms, that courage was complex, that the bravest thing you could sometimes do was admit you were wrong and choose a different path. The sun finished setting, and the hospital room filled with the soft glow of evening, and Knox held his daughter close while his wife leaned against him and his mother-in-law stood beside them all, and everything felt exactly the way it was supposed to feel. Complete, honest, true. The way Frank had wanted it. The way it should have always been. The way it finally, beautifully was.